What's good, everybody? Welcome to Origin Story, the podcast that interviews creators about where they came from to understand how they got here. My name's Philip Russell, and I'm with my co-host,
Ben Thorpe.
And we're back again with another exciting conversation with a creator that we really admire. This time it's Chandana Ekanayake, who is the founder, or the co-founder and studio director at Outerloop Games. They describe this studio as a minority-led, fully distributed indie game studio that creates accessible games with depth about underrepresented cultures and themes. And they have made Falcon Age as well as an upcoming release called Thirsty Suitors. This conversation revolves so much around that ethos around Outerloop's games and Eka's kind of interesting way of talking about not only game development but also narrative design. It was a really fun conversation, an eye-opening conversation about the industry and kind of navigating the industry as a marginalized group.
Yeah, I feel like we had this conversation like really tight on the tail of Sifu coming out, and that was a game where it kind of used a lot of imagery of kind of Asian culture, but I believe the studio is like predominantly white, and so there was a lot of conversations about like who gets to make games that are set in a specific culture and who's making those decisions. And I feel like, Phil, you and I had this conversation around season 1 because initially, like real early on, we started like looking for people to talk to. And a thing kept happening where we'd be like, "Oh, this game looks interesting, and it's got a black protagonist, or it's got a minority protagonist, or it's got a woman protagonist." And then you would go to look up the studio, and you'd be like, "That's all white guys. Like what, what happened there?" And so I feel like the conversation with Eka, really became about that ethos and like how that changes, like what it means to be a minority-led studio telling minority stories and what kind of space they occupy and how that's different and how that allows for kind of better, more interesting stories.
Yeah, I think that's like a perfect kind of context for this conversation because, Ben isn't exaggerating. Like the amount of games that we looked at prior to launching Origin Story where we were thinking like, damn, that's such a dope like protagonist or aesthetic or whatever, and then realizing like there weren't any like BIPOC people on the team. It was like astounding. It wasn't like 2 games. It was like many games on our list we had cut out because of that. So it was really interesting, I think, talking to Eka about that and like kind of how the industry has a problem with that, and how a place like Outerloop Games and other developers are like trying to find ways of telling those stories from a point of experience. And it was I really appreciated just kind of talking to him about like when you actually have people from the background that you're depicting in your game, it allows you to start the story or to nuance the story in ways where you don't need to start from 101. You can start much later on and like have a much more like specific outlook on a game. And I think that's what Falcon Age does, right? Like I think its ideas around colonization are made possible because it's being created by people who have ancestors and family members who have experienced those things, right?
Right. And I feel like, we have this conversation in other spaces. We come from the lit world. I come from the radio world, where it's like the explanatory comma, like how's your story held up when you feel like you have to explain what's happening, you have to explain some context to a specifically white audience. And then what are you able to do when you don't have to worry basically about that? And I think Eka does a really good job of talking about like how the possibilities open up when you don't have to worry about, all right, are we doing enough to make clear, to a white audience or to make something make sense to a white audience? And that's, I don't think that's just, I don't want to put words in Eka's mouth. I don't think that's to say that they don't want white people to play their games, but that it's like, as a storyteller, you don't have to worry about putting the world building of that kind for a white audience up front.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, if anything, it's kind of like thinking about the white gaze and the industry, and how, like, what happens when the emphasis switches? What happens when maybe the person that's in the narrative designer's mind isn't white? And like how that can allow these games to communicate to players differently. And it not only provides like a different experience for somebody like me who doesn't get to see many like black people in very nuanced roles in games, but it also provides like a new experience for white players as well. Like they're, when you aren't kind of the position of authority, how does that kind of influence what you understand and what you can learn from these experiences? And I think that Eka does a good job of kind of articulating that. And yeah, I don't. There's a couple other things that maybe we can get into after we listen to the conversation, not to spoil everything. But yeah, really, really great conversation. And how about we hop right into it?
Let's do it.
Chandana Ekanayake is co-founder and studio director at Outerloop Games and has over 20 years of experience as a video game designer and art director. Outerloop's first game, Falcon Age, is a sci-fi VR action-adventure about raising a baby falcon and reclaiming a cultural legacy from a force of automated colonizers. Outerloop's second game, Thirsty Suitors, is a stylish, story-driven adventure that unfolds through turn-based battles, skateboarding, and cooking, and is slated for release later this year. Thank you so much for coming and talking to both of us.
Oh, no problem. Thanks for having me.
You know, I think the first question that we're trying to start asking regularly is like, how are you? How are you feeling? How is life going generally right now?
Yeah, I mean, generally, I know I'd say probably a 7 or 8 out of 10 with given.
That's good.
Yeah. You know, I can't complain more than everyone else can, I guess. So I'm good. We're good.
That's good.
Family's healthy, so we're good.
Yeah, that's extra good. One of the things that I think like we want to really get into, because I think like you do such a good job of kind of explaining this, but you know, let's start by talking about Outerloop Games and kind of the mindset behind it. The company was co-founded by you in 2017 and kind of describes itself as a minority-led, fully distributed indie game studio that creates accessible games with depth about underrepresented cultures and themes. Can you talk about how that all came about?
Sure. I mean, I've been in games for 20, I think it'll be 25 years coming up. I started at 19, so I started pretty young. I'm not that old. I am old, but not that old. And for most of my career before starting Outerloop, which was, 2017, it's been on pretty, mostly white male teams. I think it's pretty common. Like most of the industry, I think is still pretty not as diverse as we would like. So having that experience made me really want to focus on sort of other perspectives and things that I feel like that I could bring to the table and our team. So starting the studio and focusing on for example, Falcon Age is inspired by South Asian culture and colonialism and those kind of things. So being able to tell these kind of stories and mix it with some sort of gameplay that I feel like if you're going to do a theme that's a little different, then I feel like having some gameplay that is a little more comfortable for players, so there's some way in, was sort of our idea, which we did with Falcon Age and which we're doing with Thirsty Suitors, our game about fighting your exes in South Asian culture. But it's also like a turn, it has kind of turn-based RPG kind of mechanics and skateboarding and cooking, things that people are familiar with. So kind of mixing these themes and stories that I don't think a lot of folks in the West are as familiar with more familiar gameplay was our approach, if that makes all sense.
No, that makes a lot of sense. I mean, I think we were planning on maybe jumping into Falcon Age in a little bit, but just bouncing off that, one thing I really appreciated about that game is what you're talking about. The gameplay, it isn't like super challenging in some ways, so it allowed me to really focus in on the narrative elements, and they come through so strongly. Like I loved that exploration of colonization and various forms of resistance and how people respond to it. And like you're saying, I feel as if the gameplay kind of allowed me to really focus in on the conversations as opposed to like struggling through, complex interactions at the same time.
Yeah, and that's our hope, and I'm hoping we can do a better job of it with Thirsty. Like, it's always like you look back at anything you work on. I'm sure as you all do too. It's like, oh, I wish I could have done this differently or this better. It's always going to be the case. So, I'm hoping we can do more interesting things with Thirsty coming up. So.
Yeah, I watched your keynote address that you gave for is it GCAP?
Oh yeah, GCAP. Yeah.
Yeah, and it was great, and you brought on your kind of narrative designer to kind of talk about some of the ways that kind of she thinks about work with Outerloop,
Yeah.
and talked about this idea that I think is great, which is like the way that there is some freedom when you are working in a studio, and the stories that you're telling can be to and for each other within minority spaces,
Yes.
and not having to worry about the white gaze so much. And Phil, Phil has written some reviews, particularly of like AAA games, where he talks about the limits it feels like you see in some of those games, where it's like they're holding back and they're having a conversation that is kind of still concerned about like a white player. And so maybe you can talk about like, what does that look like, and what does that allow for when you're telling stories?
Yeah, so I think so my narrative partner Megna and I work together on Falcon Age, and then we're working together on Thirsty. So we do. She's in the UK, and actually she's in India right now. So depending on time of the year, she goes visit her family. So sometimes that means like it's early morning for me or late at night for her, or some variation. But we have been meeting weekly for years now, and we talk about, especially for this game, the specificity of it is what we feel like is the thing that allows us to get away from sort of building it for an audience that's not us. Like, I feel like it's more authentic if we're putting ourselves, and there's a lot of ourselves in this game, in various forms, and I feel like the real way to be more universal with a story is be very specific with it. Mm-hmm. And that feels more authentic than trying to generalize it to appeal to an audience that you don't know who that might be. I think, and I always appreciate seeing films and stories and books and games that are very specific, and I think that makes it feel like I can connect with the people that are making the game and the characters in the game. So that's been our approach. It's a lot harder because we're always like, are people going to get this and that? But I feel like there's, at least with Thirsty, it's about, love and family drama and these kind of more universal themes. And we're doing that with Jala, our main character, through her perspective, including, fighting her exes and things like that. So yeah, our approach has been, specificity for kind of more universal approach. And I think we hope that people will identify with that, even if they're not South Asian or whatever. So.
No, that makes a lot of sense. I mean, for me personally, I went through 2 master's degrees in creative writing, and during my first one, I was the only Black person in the program. And I look back at the work that I was doing then, and like, not that I don't like it, but I feel so much of myself isn't in it because of the people I was collaborating with, versus when I went to UW for my MFA, it was the first time that I got to get feedback from other Black writers, and I had a Black thesis advisor. And like you're saying, it's really interesting thinking about the possibilities that you gain when you get to just be exposed to people who understand your experiences from the get. And I feel like the work I was making there was so much stronger and more interesting and more universal because I was able to be more specific about the things that I was talking about. I'm curious, just like, since you've had such a long career in games and you've worked at big studios, you've worked in smaller studios, and you've kind of gone through the gamut of all types of titles. I'd love for you just to talk a little bit more about what it's like at Outerloop when you're, coming up with these games and these narratives. Is it a highly collaborative thing where everybody's drawing their experiences together and then it goes into the game, or is it you and Megna kind of leading the charge in terms of the direction of whatever the next game's going to be?
So for the stuff at Outerloop, I usually have like a Google Doc that I just always throw ideas into, and and it takes me a while to kind of formulate those ideas, and I just sit on it for like a year, and then I'll pitch the team on things, see what people react to, and with Falcon Age, I wrote like a sort of a one pager of sort of the what I wanted to do with the game, and then I pitched to Magna at the time, and then we fleshed it out. And then the cool thing about it is every person on the team will bring their own sort of experiences to it. And even though it might start with me or whatever, the what ships is like very much the team's. I mean, that's the reason we work with 14 different folks on the team is they have, different specialties and different perspectives. And same with Thirsty. It started roughly, actually, Thirsty started as an idea. I have the Slack message I sent to Meg now. I was like, what do you think about this? I had the name first. So I registered the name in 2017.
Oh wow.
Thirsty Suitors. Because we were talking about our projects, and we are talking about arranged marriage and kind of how that's seen in sort of on the West and in South Asia and all, she's Indian, I'm Sri Lankan. There's like different sort of caste systems and different approaches depending on where you are in the country or countries. So we were just talking about that. I was like, oh, that might be interesting for a game. And then we were talking about suitors, and just like the word thirsty and suitor kind of came together and came up with a name that way. So when I pitched her the game, it was originally going to be about arranged marriage. But then we were talking more, and neither of us have gone through arranged marriages, or when we have family and friends, but we just felt like, you know what, that may not be the right topic for us because we're not really familiar with it. We couldn't really dive into it. So we decided to go away from the arranged marriage and made it more about exes and relationships, which we could both talk about, and obviously people on the team could talk about. So that's sort of how it started. And then the thing that really brought it together was fighting your exes when we came up with that, but that didn't happen until pretty like a couple months into sort of prototyping and figuring out the game. Yeah, I mean, that once we figured that component out, and of course there's a Scott Pilgrim, sort of, that's the first thing we noticed when we showed it. People are like, oh, it's Scott Pilgrim. I mean, I guess it is in that way because it's one of the few things in popular media that kind of deals with fighting your exes. So, but the actual gameplay for us is very different and perspective's different. But I mean, it's fine. The comparisons are fine, completely valid. But like once we figured that aspect of it out, the skating kind of came in because our animator is also a skater and does parkour. He has a huge following on TikTok and YouTube. It's a whole separate thing. So he just brought skating in. I think I had a skating loading screen that I mocked up for a prototype, and I made it look like a 90s skating video, low angle, wide, and like fisheye lens, and then people were like, oh, I want to do that. So we're like, we should try building skating out of it. So that just came out of that, and plus our animators big on skating, but he's terrible at Tony Hawk. And so we're like, can we do a more accessible skating game? And then it kind of fit into the character. So stuff like that comes through from the team, even though it might start with like one person's idea. What ends up shipping is always, there's a lot of collaboration that happens through the process. At least that's how we work.
Yeah. Can I kind of get you to talk just a little bit about the fighting your exes? I mean, is it an RPG like battler, or is it like a straight battle, or is it like conversation things? Like how's it going to work?
Yes. It's the conversation and choices and turn-based battle. It's all tied in. I think we were developing this before Yakuza, the new one. Yakuza.
Yes.
Sorry,
okay.
Excuse me.
We were going to ask because we're actually both in the midst of playing that and really enjoying it, and we were both kind of talking about how there's something about a modern setting with RPG elements that just works. Like it just works great.
Yeah, and I'm a huge Like a Dragon fan. So I wouldn't ever pitch this, but this is going on record. But it's like our game is like a smaller version of a Yakuza game. So it's like random things, baby. Random desperate things tied together with a narrative story, right? Like, so yeah, I mean, the turn-based battle is it was really inspired by Paper Mario, Thousand Year Door. So like there's active timing elements, and there's skills, and what we call willpower, but it's like magic powers and stuff like that. That includes narrative choices in the middle of combat too,
Hmm.
which Yakuza really doesn't do. So, but yeah, we're doing because of sort of our theming, and the reason the Exodus works so well is there's a built-in history when you fighting somebody. For the
Yeah.
player, they're new, but there's like this, there's a history there, and we kind of get into that through the course of a battle. So
That's awesome. No, I love that. I mean, something I've been thinking a lot about, and I'd love to get into the Yakuza stuff in a bit, is obviously dialogue, conversations, and dialogue options have been part of games for a long time. But something that I've been noticing a lot more recently, especially in indie games, is thinking more critically of how we can use conversation and the ways in which we talk to one another to add tension within like gameplay mechanics. So I think of things like Signs of the Sojourner, or even Griftlands, and how it uses conversation and debate as like another battle mechanic. I love that you're doing that with Thirsty Suitors. I'm curious, like, did that come from some of these other games that were experimenting with it, or do you think that's just kind of something that's in the air right now?
that's interesting. It's probably, a lot of these things seems like people are thinking about at the same time because of what's come before that, or what they're playing. It's hard to not be influenced by things that we're playing. It happens all the time, and not that we change the game every week because I played a new game, but like like we certainly bring our experiences to everything we create. It kind of mixes together. It's like comes to, where do ideas come from? Usually it's probably just a bunch of different experiences and somehow remixed together. With Thirsty, we knew it was a game about relationships. We're like, okay, we're doing combat, and how do we do combat in a way that you're not actually killing them? It's like it's a sort of like the equivalent of a date, but we're going to an argument, and then how do we visualize that as a kind of surreal battle? And so that's like, how do we weave the conversation bits? What do you say? And we have this whole mood system where like it's called Thirsty Suitors because thirsty is one of the moods you can like use as a taunt, and there's different types of taunts, and you can there's more angry taunts and like helpful taunts and things like that leads to how that ties into the battle mechanics and the different skills you have. I'm not going to get really into it because we haven't really shown anything up, but like generally the idea is like, okay, if we're doing a turn-based combat game, but it's about relationships, what are the themes and ideas that we can incorporate into a battle? So like it made sense to like the conversation to be part of that, as well as like physical things. And we prototyped a ton of different things. The battle system has gone through so many changes, by far. The cooking is also kind of turn-based, and you're doing it for your mom's approval. So you're not fighting your mom directly, but she has an approval meter that you're trying to get across in the course of a cooking session. The skating it's more real time, so you're running around. There's like a full skating levels, and that's how you get around the game. But there's also conversational bits thrown into that too, which we'll show later. So yeah, I mean, the theme definitely tries. We're and that's the hope with any game. It's like you have a theme, you have mechanics, and what are the ways that those two things can interact as much as possible. And that usually takes years to the point where we show it up. People are like, oh, obviously these two things work together, but it's like, no, it's just that they didn't in the beginning. We're just trying to prototype and figure out ways for those two separate things to come together hopefully in a really nice way. So.
Yeah, I think I had this question because you are a studio that is, I think, in a lot of ways, like themes are really important. We're leading in some ways with theme.
Yeah.
And so is it about finding what are the game mechanics that are going to fit best within kind of the story you're trying to tell?
Yeah. That also, and also there are so many, it was like 10,000 games on Steam that come out every year, or 5,000, some ridiculous number.
It's crazy. Yeah.
So we're like, as a team, a 14, how do we stand out? That's also a consideration, right? Like
Hmm.
the marketing business of it, because and that stuff's important because I want to be able to pay our everyone a living wage, and so we can make another one. That's like our definition of success, to be able to keep going, make another one. And how do we do that? And there's a responsibility to our employees and families, and like we have to also make sure this is a run as a business. And running it as a business in games mean making something interesting and hopefully stands out from a lot of other things. So there's considerations there too, right? Like, yes, we want to do this very specific theme and these kind of underrepresented stories. How does it fit into what the type of game we're making, and overall sort of uh, the type of game that, or type of product, essentially, right? Like, so there's always a bunch of concerns of what kind of gameplay. Falcon Age was real time first person. Bits we had VR version, non VR, and this, we felt like the turn based combat led itself to the pacing of the theme really well.
Hmm.
The conversation and the choices you make, I think those are harder if we're doing a real time combat. Yeah.
Yeah.
No, I mean, I think I've only played Falcon Age, but something I really appreciated with that game is, in my eyes, there's almost like no dissonance between the gameplay mechanics and the themes of the game. I'd almost consider the narrative, it feels almost like a poem to me. Like, I love how you start off the game and it's not this overly long explanation of like what's happening. It really just puts you in there. And I think this speaks to what you were talking about kind of at the top of the conversation of like, how much do we explain? How much do we let the player try to figure things out? And like, who are we speaking to? I just found that Falcon Age did a really, really good job. I mean, I have like notes here of just like quotes from the game of like, damn, this is such a good moment. I'd love to take a minute and talk about food though, because that's something that I've noticed, and that's going to be in Thirsty Suitors. It was also in Falcon Age, and then I like Ben said in the GCAP presentation, I loved how you went about doing that keynote
On the current one, I want to cover why we started the studio and how the makeup of the team influences the type of games we make. Representation is one of our core values. We feel like the diverse team makeup and ideas lead to more interesting games. It's great for business and a great way to stand out in a crowded marketplace. And we're going to do that while I attempt to make a meal. Mostly because I don't know what to do with my hands when I'm talking, so I thought I would keep my hands busy and then also have a snack once we're done with this talk.
I can't speak to GCAP specifically as an organization, but I could imagine that in general for a lot of those kinds of like GDC type events, there's a Western gaze there of like having to have this very stuffy, like I'm at a podium kind of conversation. And I loved that. To me, it almost felt like a point of resistance of like, I'm going to have this conversation with you that also speaks to culture. It speaks to the culture of our studio. I'd love to just, hear your thoughts on that ethos, I guess. And is that something that you try to bring into your studio and life?
Yeah, I'm going to back up a little bit and say, because so I moved to the States from Sri Lanka when I was 8. So grew up in Maryland and went to high school there and stuff. So I think for a long time I wasn't comfortable being myself, right? Like I was trying to just fit in as much as possible, because that's just, my parents like started their life over, just working odd jobs. Essentially we moved here for a better life for the kids. They're like, there's a civil war going on in Sri Lanka. They're like, it'd be safer if we had a family in Maryland. So they just kept their heads down and they were like just trying to get through. And I think that kind of had an influence on me. I have an older brother and a younger sister. My older brother's a filmmaker, younger sister's in fashion. So none of us did the immigrant route what my parents wanted, which is like doctor, engineer. So you brought us to better opportunities, and guess what? We're going to take some different opportunities than you expect. I mean, they're fine now, but at the time it was like wanting to go to art school was a which I did for a little while in Savannah, Georgia, but that was not a thing they had in their plans when they moved us across the world. But I think So part of starting Outerloop was also getting comfortable with who I am and sort of this double heritage I grew up with, and like the Sri Lankan part, and trying to be American, whatever, quote unquote, whatever that means. But I think for a long time I was just trying to fit in as much as possible, and it wasn't really working, and for me, and I wasn't quite happy. So I was trying to. Part of this doing these games is also kind of being able to revisit culture and be in touch with it. And I started cooking with my mom. I made a little videos recently when she moved back to Sri Lanka and then recently moved back to the States. And I had learned to cook from her years ago, but I was like, but the way she makes it, it's always better. So I'm like, I'm just gonna make a little video. So I was in the kitchen making these things, and I was like, it was really fun because she was having a good time. She was playing it up for the camera. So that was right before the GCAP thing came in. And I was like, oh, I should really, cooking is a big theme and something that I personally love, and I do a lot at home. And it's in the game, and this is before we announced the game. So like, I think I bleeped Meghna out with a bunch of things. I was like, let's just talk about the themes, because I think, because we've been talking about the themes a lot. And it was really interesting to talk to a couple of the folks on the team, like Emma, who's one of our Australian artists, and Sunny, who grew up in South Africa, and like she's still in school, but we just hired her recently, and she's like phenomenally talented. She's very quiet, but I once got her on camera talking about like culture and race, and she really opened up, and I really, really appreciate her doing that. So a lot of, and she does some writing on the game now too. So like the cooking was like, I was like, okay, here's a way we can kind of show what we are as a studio, is also something that I'm really into. And it was just felt like something unique. At the time I was like, this is going to be fun, but it was such a pain in the ass because I was filming myself with a lav mic wired. So I was like, oh, I can't go too far and go to the kitchen and clean up my, pots, whatever. So I was like doing takes in between, and I'm going to do it again, but this time I'm going to do the cooking segment separately and then cut in the gameplay stuff. And which is like, duh, I should have just done that from the beginning, but I wasn't thinking about it at the time. So it took a week to just get that through, to get that done. But it really spoke to what's important to me and the team, which is like bring a piece of ourselves, put a piece of ourselves out there, whether it's this talk about the game or the game itself. And it was really great to do that because Meghna and I had some great conversations. She had some amazing points, and like Emma had some amazing points, like talking about when's the first time you felt seen, and same with Sunny. So it was just really great for the team to be able to see that and work on that. And we're hoping to do more of those, because I want to remake all the recipes in the game, but in a smaller format, maybe like a 2-minute video instead of a 20-minute video.
I love that. No, I mean, I was saying to Ben before you came on that I think there's a version of that video that just feels so dishonest and like kind of like marketing material. And I felt like with the version that you all made, it felt not only genuine, but it's like something I've never seen before in this space. And it's something that I could relate to a lot, especially hearing those conversations around race and identity and how that influences the work that we do. So, I'd love to see more of those videos in any kind of shape or form. I think that industry really like needs more of that kind of stuff.
Thank you. We agree. I think, and they're fun for us to do and be able to just share a little bit of, and then the type of foods we're putting in also, like there's a South African dish that we found that we're putting in there, and there's going to be a couple other, folks on the team and some of the local foods. I think we're figuring out ways to tie all that stuff in.
I also did I hear you right that you tried to record your mom in order to get the exact way that she does a recipe? Like you literally filmed her?
Yeah, I think I tweeted a couple of those, but even then, because she doesn't. I was like, how much? She's like, oh, just a little bit of this, and
it's the exact same problem. My grandma has this recipe that has like been passed down, and the details for like how much you use are like 2 pinches or like 1 pinch, and you're like, well, that doesn't tell me anything. And so it's funny that you went to this length of like, I'm literally going to record this person.
Yeah.
Hopefully that gets to the problem.
Yeah, there's a game called Venba that is doing, it's about South Asian cooking and about having a recipe book that isn't fully fleshed out.
Huh.
And then trying to figure that out. That's part of the main mechanic, which they play tested our cooking. We play tested theirs, and it's been fun to chat with them and compare notes because there's like 2 South Asian themed games in the same year. I was like, that has never happened. So
I'm glad you brought them up. That's like a game that I keep on seeing like gifs for and stuff on Twitter, and it's like I just want them on the podcast so bad. I want to see more of the game. So yeah, it sounds great.
I think you're kind of getting into it already, but I wanted to ask about Falcon Age specifically and how much of yourself is in there, especially as I think the game is really grappling with the different ideologies of like how to come to terms with or how to think through colonization and how it's impacted you. So I was talking to Phil about like it feels like it feels similar to a lot of games where it's like I felt like there were parts of like Jedi Outcast or Portal. But the thing that really grabbed me was the way that all of the different ideologies of the different people in the game are so fleshed out. And it feels like they're fully realized, right? You have the mother who's like, this is the reason that we have to do this. Also, here's this picture of this dog. You can have a nice dog. You have the auntie who's like this resistance leader you think, but then you also have that moment towards the end where you meet other resistance leaders who are like, yeah, she's kind of a pain in the ass.
Yeah.
And I think all of that felt so real. And like, maybe you can talk about, I don't know, how is this game and how is making a game a way to also work through, your own feelings around this stuff?
Yeah. So, I mean, a lot of that came from us just having a conversation about like, Sri Lanka as a colony or, the British Empire. And our other writer, Cassandra, they're from Malaysia. So they had a lot of thoughts. They did a lot of stuff in the town where like the juggler having their own perspective and things like that.
Yeah.
Which were just great. Again, it's the specificity of that, I think, is what really comes across. So, I mean, yeah, we just had a bunch of conversations around sort of like, here's our sort of main sort of thread and main theme, and maybe some opposing conversations of characters, because that's the thing. It's like it's never like everyone is feeling the same thing at the same time, right? Even if you're supposed to be on one side or the other, because they all have people have their specific needs and specific situations and faults. So that's sort of how we approached it, and then also trying to do that in a small scale game with a very fixed number of characters. It's like, how do we so we kind of personify a certain perspective in a very particular character is what our approach is, because we're not an Ubisoft that can do that over 100 hours and hundreds of characters. So I think just distilling it down, that's always the thing with smaller scope games, is here are the things we want to do. Can we personify that with a specific character, and then can we distill this into these characters or these characters? And that's just the process that just takes time. I think time is the big thing with games. It's just like it always takes longer than you think. There's always problems. Every project's different, no matter how much experience you've had. So I think for the perspectives it came from, here's the main thread, main arc of the story, and here are some ways to kind of zigzag through it and giving the player some perspective there, because there was like this one part where you find this broken down robot who's malfunctioning, and it's like you get a different perspective of the things that you were bashing on before that. So yeah, I don't know if that answers it, but like trying to distill these ideas we have into characters that the player with direct interaction with, was because that's the other thing, is depending on the game type of game, right, is how is the player going to see this in what format. For us, it's you're having a conversation with choices, and that's you're talking directly to a character, and that was our mechanical way of getting across, and that's how we wrote those moments, because there isn't really a narration, there isn't some sort of other overarching thing that happens, and that's why we get into the game really early too. Is like mechanically, this is like, oh, can we use this security guard in the beginning to kind of establish who you are, what the world is, and what the situation is. So I'm getting pieces of the sort of the overall story and where things are, I think is always interesting. There's a little bit of mystery to the player as they move through the story. Yeah, even in linear media, I think like best storytelling is where I'm like get a little bits of this and a bit of that, enough to follow, but then there's like something surprising as you keep going. I think as things unfold, that's my I think that's what I like too. So
can I get you to talk a little bit about the ending? Is that okay?
Oh yeah, sure.
I don't know. I mean, I felt complicated about it, right?
Yeah,
You have to give up the Falcon. I think so much of the relationship that you build with the Falcon over the game feels like it's tied to this piece about I'm relearning, this aspect of my culture. I'm finding ways to familiarize myself with it. And no matter what you choose, I guess as a player, that ending is the same. That it's like you're either going to kind of leave the planet or you're going to stay with the revolution. But either way, you have to let go of the Falcon.
Right.
And it left me with this feeling of, oh, is this a piece about like no matter what happens, there are some parts that are going to be lost?
Yeah.
And is that central to that? Because I left with this like, boy, just like this really kind of morose feeling. And
because you're like, I just spent all this time with this bird. Now you're telling me to take everything off and let it go? What the hell?
And let it go. What's going on here?
So we spent some time with some falconers. There's a lot of falconers in Washington. Found out. We showed the game first time at a PAX West. Like 6 different falconers stopped by and wanted to play, and then one local to me reached out and she was like, "Oh, let me know if I can help." So we went out. Myself and several of the folks on the team, and just went to a park, and she brought her falcon and she just like fed it and flew around, and we just learned all about like falconry. And one of the things she was saying is like after so many years they let the birds go out in the wild, and I was like, oh, that's a great, it kind of tied in with the themes we were exploring in the game too. So we also changed a bunch of things in the game to make it more realistic to falconry, even though if you're not a falconer you wouldn't know. It's just there's some we definitely took some leeways with it, but like the ending was also was a combination of sort of the falcon theme, the themes we're exploring in the game, and also just like how do we end this thing. So there's like an economic need for us too. It's like I think overall we might have spent more time leading up to that, but we just kind of ran out of time too. So there's not that it was the only reason, but that was definitely like the theme thing was important. Like letting the falcon go was always a thing we were going to do. I think how we did it, we might have built it up a little bit better. So I'm not quite happy with that, but it fit well into the themes of sort of having a falcon and with so many and having keep it for so long and letting it go. Sort of the life cycle of falconry too. So that fit into that, and also the themes of letting of where Ara's journey is and what she wants to do, and she's getting pulled from multiple sides, and like the bird being a part of that and freeing it. Also, I think in a way like it's her kind of just starting over or figuring out her own path. Because I think at the end we had a couple of different sort of variations of the ending. There's one where it's like they had another little baby bird kind of hinting at more coming up, but I forget what all the depending on the choices of what you say to your mom, I think we had like slightly different sort of not that you're still letting the falcon go, but post ending. So so yeah, combination of theme and mechanics and time and all the things as always. So
was that was the idea, because one of the things I really liked about the ending was that we don't see the outcome of whatever kind of ideology you end up leaning toward. And I think that's one of the strengths of the game as a whole. Like one of the lines like you and Ben were just talking about, I love this idea of like the characters representing these ideologies while maybe not showing you the full through line. Like it allows the player to chew on things. One of the lines I really liked was, I think it's the juggler. They say, you need story and myth and laughter to remind the soul why it wants to survive. And it's amazing. It's an amazing line, and it leaves you something to chew on. was the narrative design like always intentional at the end of not allowing the player to see, like, choose, like, oh, I'm gonna go with the mom and go off world or stay with auntie?
Yeah, I'm a fan of leaving things up to some thoughts past the ending of a game. I'm not a huge fan of like multiple endings so much. Just because I feel like things, even though it's not might be the most entertaining, it just like I hope it leaves you with something past when you shut the game off. Um, so, but there's always a balance. It's probably not as satisfying as like getting this like very concrete thing at the end. But I think also with our games, we're more kind of designing hopefully the experience was good and it leaves you with something bigger at the end. And it's not always successful, right? Like it's like I'm sure Mass Effect 3 fans would probably argue about that. But yeah, no, that was always the intention was to leave it kind of open ended, up to interpretation. So.
No, that makes sense. I mean, I was going to ask. I'd be curious to see what other player responses are to it because of what you're saying. I feel like games in general, players are really used to being like, I'm going to click all the dialogue options. I'm going to make multiple save files and see what happens if I do X, Y, and Z. But like you're saying, I felt maybe it's not the most commercial ending, but it definitely left me thinking about the game more after the fact than if I just kind of knew what off-world looked like or whatnot.
Yeah, I'm also, and we're going to do this all our games, including Thirsty. It's like we don't want the player to be the center of the universe either. Like we wanted to feel like they're part of this story. And obviously the player has some agency over it, but their character isn't like, AI isn't sitting there waiting for them to show up when they show up and all that stuff. So there are things bigger than them, and that's how we kind of think about and write the characters too. Even in Thirsty, you have choices, but they're not like life-changing choices. They're smaller narrative bits, which I'm always a bigger fan of. And then the payoff comes from the game remembering your choices, and then that comes up in conversation later. Which we did a little bit on Falcon, but we're doing a lot more on Thirsty. So,
I really love that. I think so often, being the center of the universe and the whole game rotating around you can feel like weirdly exhausting. That you're like, no, I want to be a part of this world, but not the driving force in it.
Yeah, and I think there's plenty of AAA games that do that, right? Like you get the total player fantasy, and again, that's another way for us to hopefully you're playing our game because it's slightly different or a different perspective or different experience. And we can't compete with Ubisoft or Assassin's Creed. We're not trying to. So,
we do have a question here, and I kind of wanted to ask you this about I think there is a real hunger to see more video game stories told with characters that aren't white. But we're also seeing, in some ways, I think that space being filled by white or white-led or mostly white studios. In a space without any real connection to the cultures or the characters that they want to tell stories about. Obviously, I think this last kind of couple of weeks, we've seen that conversation around Sifu. We've seen that, previously around games like Ghost of Tsushima or Guacamole. Can you talk about, especially your studio being the studio that it is, what it's like to see that happen? And I think especially to see, in some ways, that it's like there's a taking of opportunities, I think, from minority-led studios when that happens. But what's your view on this, and can you just talk through how that looks?
Yeah, so I think I have very strong opinions on this, and I talk about it on Twitter too. But like, so when I pitched Thirsty, and I've talked about this in 2020, I think I had 20 some odd sort of different groups like a Sony, Microsoft, Apple's, and all the different publishers. The first point of contact, everyone I pitched to was a white male in their 30s and 40s. So it's like, not that they don't understand everything. It's just like having a diversity at the funding level, at the decision-making level, that I think could also lead. My hope is, and I think it's true, is that it leads to some more interesting content. We're seeing that on a Netflix level. We're seeing on the Amazon level. We're seeing that in other media. We're seeing projects get signed because there's folks in positions of power that come from different diverse backgrounds. And I think that only leads to just better stories and better games. So seeing something like Sifu, which I'm not the biggest fan of that, and I feel like there's probably a team that could do justice with the narrative of it. The game's gonna sell. It's already selling. Like regardless, like it's like the mechanics of the game is really really strong. It looks great. Um, I think they're missing out on the theme and storytelling aspects of not including some more folks from Hong Kong or China being a not just as consultants but being on the dev team, because there's a million choices have happened throughout a 2-year dev cycle that isn't gonna it's not the same as having someone that you bring in once a month or whatever as a consultant to say if this color red is good or this object is fine. Like there's a lot of conversations that happen on a daily basis on a dev team, and I think that leads to some really interesting, and from a perspective of someone that understands that culture a lot better. So it's still happening. It's also, I think it comes from like who's funding that and where and who's in that level. And so one of the things I'm doing is trying to help out smaller teams and trying to find, like, connect them with folks that are funding it, and just like, hey Sony, do you know about this small team that's been doing a cool thing? You should get to know them. It's just trying to change some of that on my own as much as I can too.
Yeah, and I'm just going to ask the stupid question since I don't really know. I'm sure it's different depending on the studio and when the consultant comes in and all that. But in general, like, what does that look like when a studio is bringing in a consultant to consult on some kind of cultural aspect of a game? Or
Yeah, so sometimes there's like a sensitivity reader that were brought in, either earlier or later, and to look over the script. Like, does any of this sound okay? And that's fine. There's plenty of talented people that do that, but like there's little smaller details that happen through a development, like in a given day, that I think could definitely benefit from someone that understands, or a localization or a translation that doesn't, it's like Google translated or whatever. Even if you got somebody that translated for you, but like sort of the cultural significance of this object. Like, I think Sifu's press kit was like this generic bunch of objects that wasn't specifically from the game. It's more just like, oh, this is just Chinese culture stuff, right? Which is isn't as interesting if it was something specific from one of the characters in the game, or part of the story, or specific set from the game, or things like that. So it just feels, coming back to the specificity, right? It feels generic, even though it's in the same sort of theme, but it doesn't feel strong unless it came from somebody that understood it, or was understood that culture a lot more. So.
Yeah, that makes sense. I mean, I think coupled with that, something I've been really thinking a lot about lately is, I see different postings for jobs in the games industry, and other creative industries, and something I've been seeing a lot more lately is like, the tweets that are like, oh, we have a new job posting, and we're also interested in, people from different backgrounds, or like people from marginalized backgrounds who might maybe have different kinds of experiences. But it seems to me, at least, that oftentimes when I look at those postings, they still feel so alienating in terms of getting people who maybe don't have the traditional background in. And I'm wondering, with games, if you have any ideas or perspective on how can the space open up more for people who, have, really interesting skills or backgrounds or experiences that would be beneficial to games that maybe they've never shipped a game. How can we open up more opportunities for them?
Yeah, I think one of the bigger reasons for going remote for me was to be able to work with folks that don't have to move their whole life to work at a studio, which has been traditionally the case, right? Like, and still the case for some places. But one of the good things about sort of having to be remote everywhere is that you're able to just be wherever you are and work at a studio like ours. And one of the things that we've seen and we've done is, okay, let's just see if this is something that is a good fit for you, employee and employer. Let's just do like a small contract and just see if we like working with each other. Like, some of the folks we've hired don't necessarily have sort of the requirements in a traditional role, but like we've established it in a way where like we want to work with you. Let's figure out a way to work together, and you don't have to move your whole life to do it. Like it's a little little lower friction, and us being like our goal is to have a kind of more diverse studio, and hiring for that is a lot more work, but that's like that's a core thing for us. So we're going to take the time and do it, which is a result of what you see in our team. But like I think you have to be a little more lenient, because not everyone grows up with the same amount of obviously access to technology and computers, and being able to afford going to some fancy school for game design. So I think the being remote and being able to work more remotely with better tools makes that gap a little smaller. But also it takes a studio to really make an effort, because it's really easy to hire a white dude for me right now, like super easy. So it's just much harder to find somebody. Like I think we're about 50-50 men to women right now, which is, I've never had that in any studio ever in 20 years. So and that was a conscious choice. Like we went out and make sure we talk to folks we know, and looked at places that might have more access to things. And I don't know, we just looked around and talked to a lot of folks, and to find the right candidates for what we wanted to do with the studio. So I don't know. I guess the remote stuff helped a little bit, but and I mean, I think there's funding and earlier education, and changing some of the traditional sort of requirements is a big step.
Do you mind just like briefly talking about your own path into games? Obviously, you started really young. What did that look like for you?
So I went to art school for a semester, ran out of money, came back home to Maryland. We're working at Costco, and then I was teaching myself like to do animation and stuff. And then a friend of mine was going through architecture school, and they were starting a studio to doing animation work, and we just kind of got together, worked out of a house. We didn't know anything, and we were super cheap. And I spent like a year like living out of this house and doing like architecture work and teaching myself 3D and Photoshop. And then we were sending reels around, and Bethesda was one of the companies that was local. They saw how cheap we were and how hungry we were and how talented we were. So at the time, and they hired us to do like a cutscene for one of their games. It was called Battlespire, which was like Elder Scrolls Presents before Morrowind. So that got us into Bethesda, and they're like, "Oh, these folks are kind of talented." So they hired the 5 of us to start at Bethesda. That's why I started there. So it's like everyone has a different origin story in games, and mine is definitely not a traditional one. Not something that would happen today, I don't think. So it was accidental and right place, right time, lucky. But I was mostly just self-driven to kind of. So I never finished school after that. So like I still have a chip on my shoulder for like wanting to keep learning stuff. And also just, I think also get perspective. Like I think you don't have to have a traditional schooling to do this stuff too. And then like I see a lot of folks that are 18, 19 now, they're just doing amazing stuff that's just phenomenal with the resources available. And Twitter is really a good place to find a lot of talent. I found we've hired a bunch of folks off just seeing their stuff on Twitter, like South Asian artists hashtag, and like lots of different sort of like specific hashtags that I follow for folks, and I've found and reached out to them. It's worked out that way. So I think that answered, hopefully.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. I almost want to put the question to you that you talked about earlier, and Phil's talked about this question, but like what is the media, and maybe particularly what is the game that you felt first represented by, and maybe even before that, what is the game that got you to be like, yeah, gaming is for me?
Yeah, the gaming for me was Full Throttle, LucasArts Tim Schafer game. And I've told Tim this now that I've known him as a friend. I was like, dude, that game's just, because I was really into like film and cinematography growing up, and Full Throttle was like the first adventure game that like they did like close-ups and these amazing like cutaways and like action sequences that were rendered in 3D to these close like good character moments. And I just like, you never saw that in adventure game, because adventure games were usually just like one screen at a certain perspective and scale. And plus it was like this very modern take, like this biker gang fighting the system, and which was really, really interesting. And the writing was great. The puzzles were easy because adventure games are super difficult at the time. That's the first game where I was like, oh, there's people that actually make this thing. Maybe I can learn how to do that. First game felt seen. That's a hard one.
Or movie or TV show. It doesn't necessarily have to be a game.
Yeah, I think the first thing actually got me thinking about all this stuff was Hassan Minhaj's Homecoming King. That really, like, the stuff he was talking about growing up in a small town in California was like very similar to my bringing up in a small town in Maryland, just like moving to the US. And that just really, like, I think that's what I started really thinking about Outerloop and maybe telling stories. I was like, oh, he's out here doing this and making a living doing it. And then while we were working on Thirsty, Never Have I Ever came out. And I was like, oh man, this is perfect, because it explored some of the similar things. Bender like Beckham way back when kind of did some of that. So I think, yeah, I think Homecoming King was the one that was 2017, 2016. I don't remember when that was, though. It's more recent. Yeah.
Huh, that's interesting. I was talking to Ben about that question, and I had mentioned to him that for me, I feel as if like a movie or TV show that I felt seen in was The Last Black Man in San Francisco. And Ben was like, Phil, that came out like 3 years ago or something like that. And I'm almost 30. I'm going to be 30 this year. And I've just been thinking about like, sure, there's been plenty of TV shows and films that explore Black experience and everything, but something that I've even noticed in Falcon Age, and I'm sure it's the case in Thirsty Suitors, is something that's been missing for me. I grew up in Michigan and in like an upper middle class household, and my family, both my parents are like in their early 70s, so they grew up pre-Civil Rights Act. And that generational difference that happens between like how I grew up in a mostly white neighborhood to how my parents grew up is something that I still haven't seen a lot of. And when it comes to games, this like similar, it's funny that you say Full Throttle, because I feel as if I can't think of a game that represents me personally yet, but I can definitely think of games that that really got me into gaming when I started. And I'm looking at something like Thirsty Suitors, and it's like, man, I really hope more studios start doing similar things, because I feel like it's so important, especially right now.
Yeah, I think that's the thing. I also thought about, like, exploring themes. I was like, I've gotten used to experiences through white characters. Like, other people can get used to experience through, darker characters. I think that works. Like I identify with Ben in Full Throttle. I'm not a white biker, but like, it's storytelling, right? Like we can kind of fantasize, play through the roles of the characters. So that's also kind of give me a little more confidence to kind of tell the stories we're doing too, because I think there's like universal stories and characters that you can identify with regardless of race and gender, right? So oh yeah, sorry, I want to mention a couple of things, because I was looking back at my pitch doc. I had Big Sick and Meet the Patels, because I think Homecoming King and Big Sick came maybe back to back or a couple of years after. Meet the Patels is an older documentary about this comedian. Goes back, he's his sister is a filmmaker in LA, and he documents them over 5 years. He's a comedian, where he tells his parents, okay, set me up with an arranged marriage, I'll go for it. And he had just broken up with his white girlfriend, and he's never told them about it. So they go back to India, and it's like over 5 years. It's really fascinating. It's on Amazon, but that got me thinking about these things too.
Yeah, I think what's like, like so right about what you're saying, and I think like gets to the problem of like projects like Sifu in some ways, is like there is so clearly, I think, a hunger to hear other stories, right? That it's like you cannot, like, you go any direction in the video game industry and you're going to find a white power fantasy game. Like they're just a dime a dozen, and there's all these stories told in that way. And so I think people do really want to see other stories. And so I think that gets to the kind of the insidiousness of a white studio stepping in and being like, we can fill that gap for you.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. I mean, you're seeing that with brands and like, LGBTQ flags every
Totally.
Especially this month, right? You're going to see a lot of support, a lot of empty support.
Yep.
That goes nowhere.
Gonna slap that ad together.
Yeah. It's like it's only a branding opportunity. I mean, they're seeing it as a branding opportunity, but which also means like there's a hunger for it, right? But it's like there's a right way to do it, and obviously a very cosmetic way to do it too.
Yeah. Thank you so much for coming to talk to us. I really appreciate it. And is there something that, before we end here, is there something we haven't asked you that you want to say?
No, I mean, I again, to your point, I want to see more stories like Bemba and Thirsty Suitors and from other studios. I hope there's a lot more. And from what I've seen on Twitter, I think there's people doing a lot more interesting things, and it's coming together. And I hope they find ways to bring that to market. There's like Spirit Swap. It's one of the ones I've been following, and let's see, Love Shore. Some of the folks that I follow on Twitter, those are great. Trying to think. There's Invalidate. Danny over Validate. She's doing some great stuff too. So.
And then maybe lastly, does Thirsty Suitors, and I'm on the Steam page, do we have a release date yet?
No, sometime hopefully this year.
Okay. Listen, the relationship RPG stuff is great. As soon as I saw skateboarding, I knew I was there.
Yeah. We got plenty of that. So.
And that was our conversation with Eka about Falcon Age, about Outerloop Games, a little bit about Thirsty Suitors, and I think especially just about how you can make studios like Outerloop that forefront the experiences of minority and underrepresented cultures and make really, really awesome games. I really, really appreciated this conversation, and especially talking to him about like his GCAP presentation, where he basically was cooking this old recipe from his family, and kind of using that as a gateway to not only talk about the ethos of Outerloop's games, but also different projects that they were working on. I think it was a really smart way of disrupting, and my words not his, but disrupting kind of those conference settings in ways that are really evocative.
Yeah, and I just feel like, in so many ways feels like it forefronts again story, and making you feel like at home. It doesn't feel like, I think you would talk about this in the moment, but it doesn't feel like it's an ad for the thing, and so easily it could feel kind of disingenuous, and it doesn't. It feels like very very kind of comes from a place of kind of honesty and hey, you can trust me.
Yeah. So I don't really have anything else to say. I think that this conversation speaks for itself in a lot of ways. Eka provided so many, I think, interesting insights into how you kind of make a sustainable industry that forefronts underrepresented culture. I think, if anything, it's leaving that conversation, I kind of felt like, damn, that's the kind of person that I'd want to work with, or learn from. He just seems like he has such a well of knowledge, and hearing the different perspectives on other people in his studio from doing our research, it just seems like a really good place to be.
Yeah, I feel like I also just really appreciate Phil. So often you and I will share tweets back and forth, and we're like, man, want to get more on this, right? Where it's wish I could just hear a little bit more. And so I think we had been kind of bumping a couple of tweets back and forth about Sifu and about kind of the industry as a whole. And it was great to be able to kind of sit down and actually ask him some of these questions about, hey, hey, why do you, what is your perspective on this? Why do you feel this way about this? And yeah.
Yeah, so I mean, if you all want to check out Falcon Age, I believe it's on like almost everything at this point, like Switch, Xbox, PlayStation, PC, VR. So yeah, you can check that out wherever you like to game. Outerloop is also working on a new game called Thirsty Suitors, which we talked about briefly during the show, and that should be coming out later this year. It looks sick. So definitely check out some of the trailers and promotional stuff they've released for that so far. And if you want, you can check out their website, which is outerloopgames.com. And Eka's Twitter is at Ekanaut. That's EKANAUT on Twitter. Where can they find you, Ben?
They can find me at sad_radio_lad. They can email us at theoriginstorypod@gmail.com. They can find our website, which Phil is turning into, like, honestly, one of the most beautiful websites I've ever seen. We've had a couple of friends who've started reaching out, actual web experts, and they're like, wow, that website, so professional. And I'm always like, yeah, I want to be real clear, had nothing to do with that. You can follow us on Twitter at originstory_, and you can go to our Instagram, originstory.show.
Yeah, and I just want to thank Ryan Hopper, who provided the intro and outro music that we hear at the start and finish of all the Origin Story shows, as well as Melody Hirsch, who did all the design work for the website, for the Instagram posts, and all the social posts and all that. So definitely appreciate them, and you can find me at Twitter at 3D Cisco. Don't forget, leave those reviews on Apple Podcasts and Spotify.
Even if it's a mean review, we'll take it.
Yeah, just it helps us get more exposure on the show. And I mean, honestly, I just like seeing what people have to say about the show. So hit us up.